alone and abandoned. The little girl cried beneath the trees, barefoot, bruised, and forgotten. But the Comanche hunter who found her hadn't spoken a single word in years. What he did next changed everything. The Texas wind bit like wolf fangs, tearing through Maggie Dunhill's ragged dress as she stumbled through brittle undergrowth. Her bare feet, already numb from the cold, barely registered the thorns piercing her delicate skin. 8 years old, and she knew the taste of abandonment as intimately as the salty tears that had stopped flowing hours ago. "Mama," she whispered into the freezing air, but her voice was swallowed by the wail of the wind tearing through the naked trees. Margaret Elizabeth Dunhill, Maggie to her mother, the bastard to her stepfather, carried on her small shoulders the weight of a loneliness no child should ever know. The canteen Jed had thrown at her before leaving slapped against her hip with every faltering step. She could still hear his words, delivered with a cruelty she'd learned to fear more than his fists. "You'll follow her soon enough." He meant her mother, of course, the woman who'd coughed blood for weeks while Jed drank in the parlor, cursing the money spent on useless medicine. Maggie stopped beside a skeletal tree, its bare branches reaching like pleading fingers towards the sky. The trunk was cracked, split by lightning or drought, yet still stood as stubborn and broken as she. She collapsed against its rough base, feeling the coarse bark against her bruised back. "Here," she thought with a clarity that startled her. "This is where it ends." The girl who had once played in her biological father's gardens, who had learned to read from leather-bound books and dreamed of becoming a teacher, now hugged her knees to her chest, hoping death would be gentler than life. But miles away, another broken heart beat in the chest of a man who knew the language of suffering too well. Dakota moved through the winter landscape like a shadow, his moccasins barely whispering against the frozen earth. At 38, his face bore the lines carved by profound loss. Furrows around eyes that had once sparkled with his daughter's laughter, a mouth that rarely smiled since silence had become his only companion. He'd been hunting when he saw the red-tailed hawk. The bird circled over familiar territory, but its pattern was strange, insistent. Hawks wasted no motion on purposeless flights. Every movement held meaning, every cry a reason. Dakota stopped his horse and watched, feeling that familiar prickle at the back of his neck he'd learned not to ignore. His grandmother had taught him to read the signs when he was just a boy. The erratic flight of birds, the unusual behavior of animals, the dreams that came 3 times in a row. "The spirits speak," she'd say while weaving baskets by the fire, but only to those who remember how to listen. It had been 2 years since Dakota had stopped listening to much of anything, not since a drunken settler's bullet had torn through Anna, his 7-year-old daughter, as she played by the river, not since Wiana, his wife, had begun to waste away with grief, until she became a shadow that vanished one spring morning, leaving only an empty blanket and the echo of lullabies she would no longer sing. But the hawk kept circling, and something within him, a part he thought was dead, stirred. He turned his horse west, following the bird's path. The landscape grew wilder with each mile, moving away from the occasional trader paths and deeper into territory most white men avoided. It was no man's land, dangerous for settlers and his own people alike. A place where the ghosts of the past could walk in peace. The sun began to set when he finally saw her. At first, he thought it was a bundle of discarded rags against a dead tree, but then he distinguished the dirty blonde hair, the almost imperceptible tremble of small shoulders. A white child, no older than Anna would have been now, air caught in his lungs. He approached slowly, hands visible, though he doubted the child had the strength to flee. She was conscious, but barely, her blue eyes fixed on the horizon, as if she'd already begun the journey to the spirit world. "Little one," he murmured in English, a tongue he spoke better than most white men imagined. "Can you hear me?" Maggie's eyes shifted to him, but there was no fear in them, only a resignation that broke something inside Dakota's chest. He'd seen that look before, in the eyes of wounded animals who had given up the fight, on his wife's face during those last weeks. "I should leave," he thought. "Not my concern. White men look after their own, as we do ours." But then the child spoke. Her voice was barely a broken whisper. You came to take me to Mama?" And Dakota knew he couldn't walk away. Not this time. He removed the heavy buffalo robe from his shoulders and wrapped it around her shivering, tiny body. Maggie didn't protest when he lifted her. She weighed less than a newborn fawn, and her bones felt fragile as dry twigs beneath his hands. "I won't harm you," he told her, though he knew adult words had lost all meaning for her. Instead, he hummed softly, a song his mother used to sing him, a melody that spoke of shelter and safety. As he walked toward his horse with the child in his arms, Dakota looked back at the tree where he'd found her. The first stars began to appear in the purpling sky, and the wind had ceased its wail. For the first time in 2 years, the silence didn't feel like a tomb. His winter shelter was an hour away, hidden in a valley he'd known since childhood, a place where he could decide what to do with this new burden. Because that's what the girl represented, didn't she? A burden, a dangerous complication in a life he'd purposefully made simple. But as Maggie nestled against his chest, breathing with the labored rhythm of someone fighting to stay in this world, Dakota felt something he had thought lost forever: purpose. The red-tailed hawk followed him for a while, circling silently overhead before disappearing into the growing darkness. Its work was done. In the shelter, built against the rocky side of protected hill, Dakota lit a fire and prepared a bed of warmth. Maggie hadn't spoken during the journey, but her eyes followed his every move with an intensity that unnerved him. It was the gaze of someone who had learned that survival depended on anticipating the next blow, the next betrayal. As he heated water for willow bark tea, something that would help with the fever beginning to consume her, Dakota allowed himself to truly study the child he had taken in. Her dress had once been expensive, the kind worn by prosperous merchants' daughters, but now it was torn and soiled, stained with dried blood from cuts that suggested days of struggling through hostile terrain. Her shoes had long since vanished, leaving her feet swollen and cut, but it was her eyes that disturbed him most. Too old for her face, laden with a knowledge no child should possess. "What did they do to you, little one?" he wondered as he offered her the warm tea. She took it without asking what it was, with the desperation of someone who had learned to accept any kindness, no matter its source. That night, as Maggie slept, wrapped in furs by the fire, Dakota sat at the threshold of his shelter and gazed at the stars. The temperature was dropping. Soon the snow would come, and with it, the total isolation he had sought after his losses. But now he wouldn't be alone. The girl stirred in her sleep, muttering words he couldn't understand. Her small hand clenched into a fist, as if she were fending off blows that existed only in her nightmares. Dakota felt a familiar wave of rage. Not the blind fury that had fueled him for months after Anna's death, but something colder, more focused. Someone had tried to get rid of this child. Someone had decided her life wasn't worth the trouble. They were wrong. As the snow began to fall in thick, silent flakes, covering the world with a white blanket that would erase all traces of their arrival, Dakota made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He wouldn't let her go. Not yet. His solitary peace was over. But perhaps, just perhaps, what he would find in its place would be worth the risk. The snowflakes were still falling when Dakota awoke at dawn, each silently landing on the world, transforming into a white canvas. During the night, the wind had completely ceased, leaving a stillness so profound he could hear the child's labored breathing from across the shelter. He moved carefully, adding wood to fire, making no sound. Maggie hadn't woken through the night. A deep sleep that could be healing or dangerous, depending on how hard her small body had fought before surrendering to exhaustion. When she finally stirred among the furs, the sun was already high. Her blue eyes opened slowly, blinking against a filtered light entering the shelter's opening. For a moment, confusion clouded her face, the terror waking in an unknown place. But then her gaze met Dakota's, and something in her expression relaxed. "Where?" she began, but her voice cracked. Her throat was dry, irritated by the cold and lack of water. "You're safe," Dakota said softly, keeping his hands visible as he approached with a gourd full of warm water. "Drink slowly." Maggie took the gourd with both hands, trembling not just from the cold, but from caution. Each sip was measured, as if she expected the water to be snatched away at any moment. Dakota recognized that control hunger. He'd seen it in abused animals, in prisoners, in his own people during the hardest years. "What is your name?" he asked when she had drunk enough. Maggie, she whispered. And then, as if remembering lessons in politeness from another life, she added, Margaret Elizabeth Dunhill. Dakota nodded. I am Dakota. This is my winter home. Maggie's eyes scanned the shelter, the natural stone walls, the carefully arranged furs, the carved wooden utensils hanging from pegs. Everything had a purpose, a place. It was a home created by someone who valued function over form, but who also understood that beauty could be found in simplicity. Are you going to take me back? She asked, and in her voice was something that broke Dakota's heart. It wasn't fear exactly, but resignation that sounded too adult for her 8 years. Back where? He asked, though he suspected the answer. Maggie's eyes welled with tears she didn't shed. Jed said, I was going to die. Like Mama. He said he couldn't keep me. Jed. Dakota memorized a name, feeling cold rage settle in his stomach like a stone. Whoever that man was. He had taken a child who had already lost her mother and condemned to die alone in the wilderness. Jed isn't here, he said simply, and you're not going to die. Not as long as I can help it. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm. Dakota had lived alone for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to consider another person's needs, but he adapted, as he always had, finding a strange peace in the small routines they created together. Maggie would wake when he had already started the morning fire. She ate what he gave her without complaint, though he saw her eyes light up when he prepared a rabbit stew with herbs that sweetened the taste. She watched everything he did with an intensity that sometimes made him uneasy, but gradually, he began to understand that it wasn't distrust he saw in that gaze, but a hunger for knowledge. What is that? She asked on the third day, pointing to the dried herbs Dakota was mixing. Medicine, he replied, to make your feet heal faster. Maggie studied the plants with fascination. How do you know which ones to use? My grandmother taught me, and her grandmother taught her. Dakota paused and added, Did your mother know about plants? A little. Maggie's voice softened. She had a garden before she married Jed. She grew flowers that smelled sweet, roses and jessamine. Did you like to help her? Yes. For the first time since he'd found her, Maggie smiled. Barely a ghost of an expression, but real. My hands always got dirty, but she didn't mind. She said good earth leaves good marks. Dakota felt something stir in his chest. Your mother was wise. That night, as Maggie slept, Dakota worked on something he hadn't done in years. With strips of soft leather and bone beads he had kept since Anna's death, he began to weave a small amulet. It was delicate work, requiring concentration and patience, qualities he had feared he'd lost along with everything else. When he finished, he carefully cut a lock of Maggie's blonde hair and incorporated it into the design. In his people's tradition, hair carried part of a person's spirit. By including it in the amulet, he was saying something he didn't yet dare to verbalize, that she belonged here, that her spirit was intertwined with this place. It was the 5th day when Maggie finally asked, Why? Dakota had been teaching her to identify the plants growing near the shelter, explaining which were safe to eat and which could heal different ailments. She had been listening intently, asking intelligent questions that showed a sharp mind beneath the shyness. Why? What? He replied, though he knew exactly what she meant. Why do you help me? Jed says, he said people like you hate people like me. Dakota paused, his hand still over the herbs he had been sorting. It was a question he had been avoiding, because the answer would force him to confront truths he had buried deep. Jed was wrong about many things, he said finally. Hate is a choice like kindness. But you don't hate me. No. The word came out stronger than he had intended. I once had a daughter. Her name was Anna. Maggie looked at him with a wisdom that went beyond her years. What happened to her? She died. Dakota had spoken of this so few times that the words felt strange in his mouth. A white man shot her because he was afraid. He was afraid of a 7-year-old girl picking flowers by the river. Silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of shared losses. Then Maggie spoke, her voice so soft it was almost lost in the wind. I'm sorry. Me too, Dakota said. I'm sorry about your mother. Something shifted in that moment. An invisible barrier tumbled down, and for the first time since he'd found her, Maggie truly looked at him. Not as a potential threat or an uncertain savior, but as someone who understood the particular language of grief. That afternoon, Dakota took her to an overlook that offered view of the entire valley. The snow had stopped falling, and the world stretched out before them in a breathtaking white vastness. Maggie stood silently for a long time, simply observing. "Is it yours?" she asked finally. "No one owns the land," Dakota replied. "But yes, this place knows me and I know it. Can I know it too?" It was a simple question, but Dakota understood what she was truly asking. Could she stay? Could she find a place here, in this world that was so different from her own? "Yes," he said, and as he spoke that word, he felt something stir within him. "You can." As they returned to the shelter, they passed a herd of deer grazing in a protected clearing. The animals watched them with curiosity rather than fear, and Maggie stopped to admire them. "They're beautiful," she whispered. "Yes," Dakota agreed, "and free." Maggie looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully interpret. "Do you think I'll ever be free?" "You already are," he said. "You just need time to remember it." That night, after Maggie fell asleep, Dakota placed the amulet he had made around her neck. She didn't wake, but her breathing became deeper, calmer. For the first time in days, she didn't murmur in dreams or stir restlessly against nightmares. Dakota sat by the fire, watching the flames dance, and feeling something he had thought lost forever. Hope. This broken child had come into his life like a sign, and he had chosen to respond. He didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in 2 years, he had something worth getting up for each morning. The wind had returned, whispering through cracks in the rocks, but it no longer sounded like a wail. It sounded like a promise. It was then he heard the thud of hooves in the distance, the sound barely audible over the wind, but unmistakable to trained ears. Someone was riding to the territory, and judging by the animal's haste, it wasn't a casual traveler. The peace he had begun to build around Maggie and himself was about to be tested. Dakota moved to the shelter entrance and listened more intently. The hooves faded, but he knew they would return. They always did. He looked back at the girl sleeping by the fire and felt his hands clench into fists. Whoever was coming, they would have to go through him to take her. His isolation was over. His fight was about to begin. The hooves Dakota had heard in the distance belonged to a man who had turned finding lost people into a lucrative art. Elias Pruitt rode with the confidence of someone who knew the value of patience and meticulous investigation. At 45, he had learned that people left trails invisible to most, but obvious to those who knew how to read them. The poster in his saddlebag showed the face of a clear-eyed blonde girl with the word reward $500 printed in large letters beneath. Margaret Elizabeth Dunhill, 8 years old, missing 3 weeks ago near Cedar Creek. What the poster didn't mention was that the man who reported her missing had waited 2 weeks before contacting authorities, or that his story about an accident during a storm didn't quite match the testimonies of nearby neighbors. But Pruitt wasn't paid to ask moral questions. He was paid to find and deliver, and the girl's paternal grandfather had been very clear about his expectations. Maury Ellis's trading post stood like a solitary sentinel on the edge of civilization, where settler trails faded into Comanche territory. Maury had chosen location deliberately, close enough to both worlds to trade with anyone, far enough to avoid uncomfortable questions about her methods. When Pruitt arrived at her door that cold afternoon, she was sorting beaver pelts by her hearth. She didn't look up immediately, a habit she developed to assess visitors before committing to courtesy. "Madam Ellis," Pruitt said, removing his hat with a flourish that was too elaborate to be sincere. "Elias Pruitt, recovery agent. I was wondering if I might steal a few minutes of your time." Maury finally raised her gaze, studying the man on her threshold. Had the kind of smile she'd seen on snake oil salesmen and politicians. Bright on the surface, but never reaching the eyes. His clothes were too clean for someone who had ridden for days, and he wore his weapons with the familiarity of one who used them for profession, not protection. "Depends on what you're looking for," she replied, drying her hands on a rag. "If it's trade, I have furs. If it's information, that costs extra." Pruitt chuckled, a sound meant to be charming. Straight to the point. I like that in a businesswoman. He pulled the poster from his coat and extended it. I'm looking for this child. Went missing a few weeks ago. Her family is naturally concerned. Maury took the poster and examined it carefully. Maggie's face stared back on the paper, but there was something in the depiction that unsettled her. The artist's eyes had captured a sadness that shouldn't exist in an 8-year-old. What kind of family waits 3 weeks to start looking? She asked, keeping her voice neutral. The kind that hoped she'd turn up on her own, Pruitt replied without missing a beat. Stepfather thought she'd run off and would come back when she was hungry. Unfortunately, the territory out here is unpredictable. And you believe she's alive? I have reason to hope so. Pruitt took a step closer, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. There have been sightings. A trader saw a Comanche rider near Cedar Creek about the right date, carrying something wrapped. Maury felt something cold settle in her stomach. She knew only one Comanche who frequented that area, and the description fit Dakota too well. But she kept her expression carefully neutral. Comanches have been peaceful in this region, she said. Why would they take a white child? Who can understand their motives? Pruitt shrugged. Perhaps vengeance, perhaps other purposes. The point is, I need to track down that sighting. And what happens to the girl if you find her? She goes home to her family. Of course, her grandfather is very eager to be reunited with her. He's a man of considerable resources. The way he said resources made Maury feel sick. She'd seen enough dysfunctional families on the frontier to recognize when money was more important than a child's well-being. I haven't seen any lost child, she said firmly, and my dealings with the local Comanches have been peaceful. I don't believe they would have reason to take anyone. Pruitt studied her face for a long moment, then smiled, but this time the expression was not meant to be friendly. Of course. But if you were to recall something, there's $100 for information leading to her recovery. That's a lot of money out here. It is, Maury agreed. I'll be staying in town tonight. For a few days, I expect, until I exhaust all local possibilities. Pruitt put his hat back on. Thank you for your time, Madam Ellis. I'm sure we'll see each other soon. After he left, Maury stood at her door for a long time, watching the retreating figure. Finally, she headed to her stable and began to saddle her horse. There was a conversation she needed to have, and it couldn't wait until morning. Dakota was preparing dinner when he heard the distinctive sound of Morin's horse approaching the shelter. Maggie looked up from the small basket she was weaving, a project he'd taught her to keep her hands busy and her mind focused on beautiful things. Stay here, he told her softly, and she nodded, not asking. In the weeks they had spent together, she had learned to trust his instincts. Morin dismounted before her horse came to a complete stop, her movements taut with urgency. Dakota, she said without preamble, we have a problem. He led her a few yards from the shelter, where they could speak without Maggie hearing. Morin told him about Pruitt's visit, describing both his words and the things he hadn't said. When she finished, Dakota remained silent for a long moment. Do you know this man? He finally asked. By reputation. Elias Pruitt isn't just a bounty hunter. He's a good one, and he doesn't stop. Morin paused. Dakota, that child you have is Maggie Dunhill. He didn't respond directly, but the expression on his face was answer enough. Damn it, Morin muttered. Do you know what happened to her? Why she was alone in the wilderness? Her stepfather abandoned her to die after her mother died of fever. Jed Harmon. When Dakota nodded, Morin spat on the ground. That cowardly bastard. You should have known him. Enough to know he shouldn't have a child in his care. But Dakota... Morin put a hand on his arm. The girl's grandfather has money and connections. If Pruitt finds you with her, the truth about Jed won't matter. They'll only see a Comanche with a white child. Dakota felt a familiar coldness of rage settle in his chest. And what do you suggest? That I hand her over to men who see her as property. I suggest you think carefully about your next move. Pruitt is dangerous, yes, but he's meticulous. And if he already suspects a Comanche has her. From the shelter came the sound of Maggie coughing, a dry cough she developed in the past few days. The sound made both adults tense. She's sick, Dakota said. How sick? Nothing serious yet, but she's been in the cold too long before I found her. Her body is still recovering. Morin closed her eyes. Dakota, if Pruitt finds her in that condition, he'll say you're keeping her sick on purpose. He'll use anything to justify taking her. Then he can't find her. You can't hide forever. And if you flee deeper into Comanche territory, your own people might not understand why you risk their safety for a white child. Dakota fell silent, considering the options narrowing around him like a noose. Every path seemed to lead to the same place, losing Maggie or endangering everyone he loved. There's another option, Morin said slowly, but it will require trust on your part, which, let me speak to my brother in town. He's a justice of the peace, and while he can't do much against a federal agent, he might be able to delay things, buy time for the truth about Jed to come out. And risk your own safety, Morin. Morin looked him straight in the eyes. That child reminds me of my own daughter, the one I lost 3 years ago to pneumonia. I couldn't save Sarah, but maybe I can help save Maggie. From the shelter came Maggie's voice, faint but clear. Dakota, is everything all right? He looked toward the shelter, then back at Morin. How much time do you need? A week, maybe 2 if I'm lucky. Then you have a week, Dakota said. But Morin, if this goes wrong. I know, but some things are worth the risk. As Morin rode her horse back to town, Dakota returned to the shelter where Maggie waited with worried eyes. Who was that? She asked. A friend, he replied, sitting by the fire. Someone who wants to help us. Maggie studied his face with that unsettling perceptiveness she had developed. Is there trouble? Dakota considered lying, protecting her from the knowledge of what was coming. But he had learned that Maggie was stronger than she seemed, and that well-intentioned lies often cause more harm than carefully shared truth. There are men looking for you, he said finally. Men who want to take you back. Maggie's face paled. Back to Jed? No, to your paternal grandfather. I don't know him, she whispered. I've never met Papa's family. That doesn't matter to them. Legally, you have value to them. Maggie curled deeper into furs, but her voice remained steady. Are you going to hand me over? No, Dakota said, and in that word, he put all the force of a sacred promise. Not while I breathe. That night, as Maggie slept, Dakota sat by the shelter entrance with his rifle across his knees. The wind had brought the smell of snow, and something else, a premonition that his carefully constructed life was about to be shattered once again. But this time, he wouldn't stand by and watch what he loved be taken. This time, he would fight. The decision to take Maggie to his people's winter camp was not an easy one for Dakota. For 2 years, he had avoided his kin, carrying his grief like a wound that refused to heal. But as he watched Maggie fight the fever that had worsened overnight, he knew he needed more help than he could offer alone. Where are we going? Maggie asked weakly when he began packing their few possessions at dawn. Her voice was hoarse, and small beads of sweat glistened on her forehead despite the cold. To see my family, Dakota replied, carefully wrapping the medicines he had prepared. There's someone there who can help you feel better. Maggie nodded without protest, but he could see the anxiety in her eyes. In the weeks they had spent together, her world had shrunk to the security of the shelter and Dakota's constant presence. The thought of facing strangers, even those he called family, terrified her. What if they don't like me? She whispered as he bundled her in furs for the journey. They will, Dakota said with more confidence than he felt. But Maggie, listen to me. My people have suffered greatly at the hands of white men. Some may be afraid of you at first. Others may be angry. But they will not harm you. I won't allow it. The journey to the camp took most of the day. Maggie rode in front of him, nestled against his chest, dozing at times and waking to observe the changing landscape. As they approached his people's sacred territory, Dakota felt a familiar mix of belonging and pain that always accompanied his return home. It was the children who saw them first, their shouts of alarm and curiosity filling the cold air. Dakota is back. But their voices quieted when they saw what he carried with him. No Coney emerged from his teepee before Dakota dismounted. At 55, his father's brother bore the marks of a man who had lived through terrible times and survived with his wisdom intact. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, moved immediately from Dakota to the child in his arms. "Nephew," he said simply, but in that word were years of unasked questions and silent reproaches. "Uncle," Dakota replied, dismounting carefully so as not to disturb Maggie. "I need your counsel, and she needs your healing." A circle of people had formed around them, men, women, and children whose expressions ranged from curiosity to open hostility. Dakota recognized many faces, but he also saw the new lines of suffering that had appeared in the 2 years of his absence. "Is she yours?" a voice from the crowd asked. It was Anna, not his lost daughter, but his cousin, who bore the same name. Her tone carried the edge of accusation. "She is mine now," Dakota said firmly. "I found her dying in the wilderness, abandoned by her own people." "White people abandon what doesn't serve them," someone else murmured. "Why should we carry their refuse?" No Coney raised a hand, and the murmuring ceased immediately. "Let's take her inside," he said. "She is sick, and the cold does not help. We will speak after." No Coney's teepee was the largest in the camp, decorated with symbols that told the story of his lineage and his visions. Dakota had spent many evenings of his youth here, learning the traditions he now feared he had betrayed by bringing Maggie. The elder Eatsell, the camp's healer, was already waiting with her medicine bags. Her hands, wrinkled but firm, examined Maggie with professional efficiency that reassured Dakota. The child submitted to the examination without protest, though her eyes followed every movement with caution. Fever of the lungs, Eatsell diagnosed within minutes. Not serious yet, but it could worsen without treatment. She has been malnourished for a long time. "Can you cure her?" Dakota asked. "Yes, but she will need rest and constant care. And you," she looked directly at Maggie, "will need to be brave. Little one, the medicines do not taste good, but they will make you strong." Maggie nodded solemnly. "I will do whatever it takes." Eatsell smiled, the first genuinely warm expression Maggie had received since her arrival. "Good child. Now sleep. When you wake, we will make you soup that will heal both your body and your spirit." As Maggie slept under Eatsell's watchful eye, the men gathered around the central campfire. The conversation Dakota had dreaded for the entire journey was about to begin. "Explain to us," No Coney said without preamble, "how this white child came to be under your protection." Dakota told the full story, from the hawk that had guided him to finding Maggie beneath the dead tree, to Morin's arrival with news of the bounty hunter. When he finished, silence stretched like smoke in the cold air. "White people seek what is theirs," Anna said finally, "as they always have, as they did when they came for our lands, our buffalo, our children." "This is different," Dakota protested. "She is a child, not a soldier. And her own people cast her aside. And that makes her our responsibility?" Another man asked. "Dakota, we have lost too much already. Would you risk the safety of our families for a stranger?" "She is not a stranger." Dakota's voice rose. "She is—" He paused, struggling to find the words for something he barely understood himself. "The spirits sent her to me, as they sent the hawk." No Coney studied him with piercing eyes. "You believe this is a vision?" "I believe Anna died so that I could save this child," Dakota said, the words coming in a torrent he had been holding back for weeks. "I believe my daughter is speaking to me through her, and I believe that if I hand her over to men who see her as property, I will betray everything I was taught about honor and protection." The silence that followed was different, more thoughtful, less hostile. "I have had dreams," No Coney said slowly. "Dreams of a dead tree sprouting white flowers, of a hawk carrying medicine in its talons. I did not understand their meaning until now." "Uncle, dreams come 3 times when they're true," No Coney continued, "and this has come 3 times. But Dakota, even if the spirits have sent us this child, we must consider the consequences of keeping her." "What consequences?" "White people do not understand adoption as we do. They will not see a child saved. They will see a child stolen, and they will come with soldiers." From No Coney's teepee came the sound of Maggie's cough, followed by Eatsell's soft voice speaking to her in Comanche. The sound made several of the men tense. "She's already learning our language," someone observed. "She is intelligent," Dakota said with pride. She asks about everything: plants, traditions, stories. And what happens when she learns enough to understand what we say about her people? Anna asked, when she knows the true stories of what white men have done to us, then she will know the truth, Dakota replied, and she will be able to choose what kind of person she wants to be. That night, after the discussions had settled and the camp had fallen into its nightly routine, Nokoni led Dakota to a secluded spot by the river. Your heart is healing, the elder observed. I can see it in how you speak of her, how you protect her. But nephew, healing your own pain does not justify endangering our entire people. I do not ask them to fight my battles, Dakota said, only to understand why I must fight. And if you were offered a choice, if you could keep her, but you had to live away from us. Dakota considered the question for a long moment. If that is the only way to keep her safe, then yes. I hoped you would say that. Nokoni put a hand on his nephew's shoulder. Tomorrow, we will hold the adoption ceremony. The child will be given a Comanche name and will officially become part of our family. Afterwards, if the white men come, they cannot claim her as stolen property. She will be our adopted sister, legally, according to our laws. The others will agree. Some will resist. But I have spoken with the elders tonight. The dreams were compelling. Nokoni paused. And the way Eatsel speaks of the child, she says she has a strong spirit that belongs here. Eatsel is rarely wrong about such things. When they returned to camp, they found Maggie awake, sitting with Eatsel and learning to weave beads into traditional patterns. Her fever had broken, and there was color in her cheeks for the first time in days. Dakota, she called when she saw him. Eatsel is teaching me to make a bracelet. She says each bead tells a story. And what story are you telling? He asked, sitting beside her. Maggie held up the half-finished work, pointing to the blue and white beads she had chosen. It's about a little girl who got lost in a storm, but an eagle found her and took her to a safe place. Dakota felt something stir in his throat. That's a good story. Eatsel says tomorrow I can have a true name, Maggie continued, her voice filled with careful excitement. A name that means something important. Would you like that? Yes, she said simply. I would like to belong somewhere. That night, as the camp slept, Dakota stayed awake by the fire, watching Maggie sleep peacefully for the first time since he had found her. Tomorrow, she would officially be his daughter, according to his people's laws. But somewhere in the territory, Elias Pruitt was still searching, drawing ever closer. The peace he had begun to build around Maggie was about to be tested in ways he couldn't fully anticipate, but for the first time in 2 years, he wouldn't face that test alone. His people had chosen to accept Maggie. Now he would have to prove that choice wouldn't destroy them all. The adoption ceremony had begun at dawn, with the smoke of copal rising into the sky in sacred spirals. Maggie, dressed in a soft buckskin dress adorned with beads the camp women had worked on tonight, looked small but dignified by the ceremonial fire. Agioka, Nokoni had pronounced as he placed his hands on the child's head. She who brought joy back to a broken heart. The name had felt right on the lips of all present, as if it had always been hers. Even those who protested her presence most strongly had fallen silent when they saw how Maggie, now Agioka, responded to the ceremony with a solemnity and respect that honored the traditions of her new people. But the peace of that sacred morning shattered when the scouts galloped into camp shortly after noon. "Riders!" shouted young Chaska, leaping from his sweating horse. 3 white men, armed, less than an hour away. One wears a star, a sheriff. Nokoni tensed. Are they coming directly toward us? Yes, grandfather, as if they knew exactly where to find us. Dakota's eyes met Nokoni's across the lingering smoke of the fire. Both knew what this meant. Pruitt had found their trail. Take Agioka to the women's teepee, Nokoni murmured to Eatsel, and keep the children away. But before the healer could move, Agioka spoke, her clear voice cutting through the rising panic. No. All eyes turned to her. The girl who had been trembling with fear just days before now stood with a resolve that painfully reminded Dakota of his own lost daughter. If they come for me, Agioka continued, I should not hide. It is not fair for you to lie for me. Little one, Eatsel began, but Agioka shook her head. Dakota told me that bravery isn't not being afraid. It's doing the right thing even when you are afraid. She looked directly at Dakota. Is that true? Dakota felt his heart swell with equal parts pride and dread. It is true. Then I will stay with my family, Agioka said firmly. But Dakota, if these men want to hurt you for saving me, nothing will happen to you, he interrupted her, though he wasn't sure he believed his own words. No, Coney and I will speak with them. You just stay close to me. Elias Pruitt arrived at the camp as he had arrived at everything in his life, with calculated confidence and the certainty that the laws of white men would prevail over any other consideration. Flanked by the local sheriff and a deputy whose nervousness was visible from a distance, he rode directly into the center of the camp, where the Comanches had formed a defensive semicircle. His eyes immediately found Agioka, who stood between Dakota and Oconee, her chin raised in silent defiance. A smile spread across his face, the expression of a man who had just confirmed his investment of time would pay off. Gentlemen, he said, addressing both the Comanches and his companions, it seems we've solved our mystery. Oconee stepped forward. Every inch the leader he had been for decades of difficult negotiations. I am Oconee, chief of this camp. What business brings you to treaty territory without permission? Official business, Pruitt replied, pulling a document from his coat. I have here a court order for the recovery of Margaret Elizabeth Dunhill, a missing minor. His eyes moved deliberately to Agioka. I believe we found her. There is no Margaret here, Dakota said, stepping half a pace forward. There's only Agioka, my adopted daughter, according to the laws of our people. Pruitt laughed, a harsh sound that made several of the warriors clench their fists. Adoption? Since when can savages legally adopt white citizens? The insult fell over the camp like a spark on dry grass. Dakota felt his hand instinctively move to his knife, but Oconee's steady voice stopped him. Watch your words, white man. You are in our territory, surrounded by our warriors. Threats will not serve you here. The sheriff, an older man who clearly preferred to be anywhere else, cleared his throat nervously. Look, we don't want trouble. We just want to take the girl back to her family. Her family? Agioka's voice rose for the first time since the men arrived. Do you mean Jed? The man who left me to die in the wilderness? Pruitt dismounted and approached, keeping his hands visible but in a position where he could quickly reach his weapon. You mean the man who's been desperately searching for you, child? Who's been sick with worry since you went missing? You're lying. Agioka cried, and for the first time since the confrontation began, her composure broke. He told me I was going to die. He told me to follow Mama soon. He wanted me dead. Children often misunderstand the words of adults when they're distraught. Pruitt said softly, but his eyes were hard as flint, especially after being influenced by certain elements. The implication was clear. The Comanches had brainwashed the child against her own family. Enough, Dakota said, his voice dangerously low. I have heard enough lies. Lies! Pruitt turned to him with renewed aggression. Let's talk about lies. You told this child her stepfather abandoned her? You filled her head with stories about her own family. I told her the truth. The truth, according to a savage who kidnaps white children? That was the final straw. Dakota moved toward Pruitt, but it was Agioka who intervened, stepping directly between the two men with a ferocity that surprised everyone present. Don't call my father a savage, she cried, glaring at Pruitt with fury that seemed too great for her small body. He saved me when your people left me to die. He gave me a family when my own cast me aside. Child, Pruitt began, his tone now condescending, you've been confused by... I am not confused. Agioka turned to the sheriff, appealing directly to him. Sheriff Morrison, you seem like a good man. Why don't you ask why Jed waited 2 weeks before reporting me missing? Why don't you ask the neighbors what they saw? The sheriff looked uncomfortably between Agioka and Pruitt. Well, because you'll find the truth. Agioka continued. And the truth is, Jed Harmon took me into the wilderness and told me never to come back. He told me I used too much money on the doctor for Mama. He told me I was a burden he could no longer afford. Children's stories, Pruitt began. They are not just stories. A new voice interrupted. Everyone turned to see Maury Ellis emerging from behind one of the teepees. She carried a leather satchel in one hand and an expression of steely determination on her face. "Morin," Pruitt growled. "What in hell are you doing here?" "Making sure the truth is told," she replied, approaching the group. "Sheriff Morrison, is it? I have a few things I think you should see." She opened the satchel and pulled out several papers. "These are signed testimony from 3 neighbors who saw Jed Harmon take this child into the wilderness. I also have a statement from the doctor who treated her mother, confirming that Jed refused to pay for medicines that could have saved her." Pruitt went pale. "Those documents have no legal standing." "I also have this," Morin continued, pulling out another paper. "A letter Jed wrote to Maggie's grandfather a month ago, inquiring about the child's inheritance and when he could claim it." The silence that followed was deadly. Even the deputy, who had remained quiet until now, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Is this true?" the sheriff asked, addressing Pruitt directly. "Did you know about this?" Pruitt took too long to answer, and that pause was as revealing as any confession. "My job is to find and return the child. The circumstances of her disappearance are not exactly relevant." "They are relevant," the sheriff interrupted, his voice now firmer, "especially if we're talking about turning her over to someone who tried to kill her." "There's no evidence of attempted murder," Pruitt protested, but his former confidence had vanished. "Child abandonment," Noconi said quietly. "In our laws and in yours, that is a serious crime." Pruitt looked around the circle of hostile faces, quickly calculating his options. His gaze settled on Agioka, and for a moment, something cruel flashed in his eyes. "All right," he said finally. "Perhaps the stepfather isn't the ideal option, but that doesn't change the fact that this child has a legitimate grandfather who wants to care for her, a man of considerable means who can give her a proper education, a proper future. A grandfather who never bothered to meet her until he learned she might inherit land?" Maury asked dryly. "A grandfather who can give her a place in civilized society," Pruitt countered, his voice hardening again. "Not a life as a savage in teepees." It was an Agioka spoke, her voice clear and firm. "And what if I don't want to go?" "It's not your choice," Pruitt said sharply. "You're a minor." "I was a minor when Jed abandoned me," she retorted. "I was a minor when he decided my life wasn't worth the cost of Mama's medicines. But now I am Agioka, daughter to Coda, sister of this people, and I choose to stay." Pruitt moved then, faster than anyone expected. His hand shot toward his gun, not aimed at Dakota or Noconi, but directly at Agioka. "This conversation is over," he snarled. "The girl comes with me now, or—" He didn't finish the threat. Dakota moved like the predator he had been trained to be since childhood. His knife appeared in his hand as it materialized from thin air, and before Pruitt could complete his move, the blade was pressed against his throat. "Touch my daughter," Dakota murmured, his voice more dangerous for being so quiet. "And it will be the last thing you do." The camp had fallen completely still. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. It was a sheriff who finally broke the silence. "Mr. Pruitt, put down your weapon. Now." "Sheriff, I said now." Slowly, Pruitt obeyed. Dakota kept his knife in position for a moment longer, then stepped back, positioning himself protectively in front of Agioka. "Sheriff Morrison," Noconi said with all the dignity of his position, "I suggest you take this man from our territory. His behavior has violated both our laws and yours." The sheriff nodded slowly. "Mr. Pruitt, you are under arrest for threatening violence against a minor." "You can't do this." Pruitt exploded. "I have rights. I have a court order." "You had a court order," Maury corrected. "But that was before you threatened to kill a child in front of witnesses." As the sheriff and his deputy led Pruitt away, he continued shouting threats and promises of revenge until he was out of earshot. Agioka turned to Coda. "Is it over?" she asked softly. "For now," he replied, and then, because honesty was what she deserved, he added, "But others will come. This isn't truly over." Agioka nodded, showing once again that unsettling wisdom that seemed too old for her years. "Then we will prepare for when they come. Not you will prepare, or they will prepare. We will." In that word, Dakota heard his final choice. Not the choice of a scared child seeking protection, but of a young woman claiming her place in the world she had chosen as her own. As the sun began to set over the camp, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, father and adopted daughter stood together, looking out the horizon where other troubles undoubtedly awaited them. But for the first time since Anna had died, Dakota didn't feel alone in facing what came. He had a daughter to protect, a people who supported him, and a cause worth fighting for. It was enough to begin. 3 months later, spring had arrived in the territory, like a promise fulfilled, painting the landscape with tender greens and wildflowers that carpeted the valleys with colors that seemed impossible after the long winter. Agioka walked beside Dakota on the familiar trail that led to the place where it had all begun, carrying in her hands a small cedar sapling they had nurtured during the cold weeks at camp. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Dakota asked as they approached the skeletal tree where he had found her months ago. "Yes," Agioka replied, her voice firm but soft. "Each cell says planting something good where something bad ended helps heal both the land and the spirit. And I want this place to have new meaning." The dead tree still stood. Its bare branches, now crisscrossed with young vines, had begun to climb its cracked trunk. But around its base, small wildflowers had begun to sprout. Blue lupins and red Indian paintbrush, transforming what had once been a place of despair into something that whispered of renewal. Agioka knelt beside the trunk and began to dig with her hands. As Dakota had taught her, the earth was soft and rich, nourished by the fallen leaves of past winters. As she worked, she spoke in a low voice, as if sharing secrets with the earth itself. "I've been thinking a lot about Mama lately," she said without looking up. Not in a sad way like before, but remembering the good things, like when she taught me about the flowers in her garden, or when she read me stories before bed. Dakota sat on the ground beside her, watching her small but sure hands as she prepared the hole for the cedar. "What kind of stories?" "Stories about brave princesses who saved others instead of waiting to be saved." She smiled. "Agioka, I think you would like to know I became brave in the end." "You were brave from the beginning," Dakota said softly. "You just needed a safe place for that bravery to grow." Agioka carefully placed a small cedar into the hole and began to cover its roots with earth. "Dakota, do you ever miss your old life? When you lived alone and didn't have to worry about keeping anyone else safe?" The question surprised him with its directness, but he had learned that Agioka rarely asked questions without a deep reason behind them. "Sometimes I miss the simplicity," he admitted, "but I don't miss the loneliness. And I don't miss waking up every morning without a purpose. Am I your purpose now? You are part of it. But Agioka, my purpose is not just to protect you. It's to help you become who you are meant to be. And I believe you're doing the same for me." She finished planting the cedar and sat back on her heels, admiring her work. The young tree looked fragile against the massive trunk of the dead tree, but there was something determined in the way its tiny branches reached for the light. "I have something else to do here," Agioka said, pulling a folded piece of paper from her medicine bag. "Each cell helped me write a letter to Mama in English and in Comanche, so she can understand it no matter where she is now." Dakota watched as she dug a small hole next to the cedar and carefully placed a letter inside, covering it with earth and a flat stone she had brought from camp. "What did you tell her?" "That I miss her, but that I'm well, that I found a family who loves me, and a place where I belong. And," her voice cracked slightly, "that I hope she's proud of who I'm becoming." Dakota felt tears sting his eyes, tears he no longer feared shedding. "I am sure she is proud," he said, "as proud as I am." They sat in silence for a moment, watching as butterflies began to visit the wildflowers growing around the tree. It was a comfortable silence, filled with mutual understanding and peace. The sound of approaching horses made them tense, but when Maury Ellis appeared in the clearing, both relaxed. The woman dismounted with a genuine smile, an expression that had appeared more frequently on her face in the months since the confrontation with Pruitt. "I expected to find you here," she said, approaching to admire the newly planted cedar. "Beautiful work, Agioka. This place already feels different. Any news?" Dakota asked, because Morin's visits lately often brought information about the outside world. "Good news," she confirmed, smiling more widely. Pruitt was convicted of criminal threat and reckless endangerment. More importantly, my brother, the judge, has formalized the adoption under territorial law. Agioka is legally your daughter now, no matter what any distant grandfather might say. Agioka let out a joyful cry and hugged Morin tightly. Does that mean no one can take me away? It means they have to go through a lot of very determined people, Mori replied, returning the hug, including me and Jed. Dakota asked, Jed Harmon has discreetly vanished from the territory. Something about seeking new opportunities in California. Morin's smile turned slightly fierce. Apparently, several of his creditors were looking for him to discuss certain financial irregularities. Irregularities? It turns out he'd been spending Agioka's inheritance for months, hoping she'd die, so there would be no one to ask questions. My brother made sure the appropriate authorities were informed. Dakota nodded with satisfaction. Justice sometimes arrives in unexpected ways, but it arrived. There's another thing, Morin continued, her tone turning more serious. More families have been moving into the area. Good families, mostly. Some have been asking about trade with your people. And some have been asking specifically about you, about me, about the Comanche man who saved a white child and raised her as his own. Your story has spread. Dakota, there are people who want to know you, to learn from you. Agioka looked between the two adults. Is that good or bad? It could be both, Dakota admitted. But I think it is mainly good. It means that perhaps, slowly, things are beginning to change. That afternoon, as they rode back to camp, they stopped on an overlook that offered a panoramic view of the valley. In the distance, they could see the smoke of the Comanche campfires, but they could also see new structure that appeared in the last month. A one-room schoolhouse, a trading post built halfway between Comanche territory and the settler settlements, and the beginnings of what looked like a small community built around the idea of peaceful coexistence. Do you know what I want to do when I grow up? Agioka said suddenly. What? Dakota and Mori asked at the same time. I want to be like a bridge, she said, her voice thoughtful, between the Comanche world and the white world. I want to help people understand each other, like you helped me understand myself. Dakota felt his heart swell with pride. And how would you do that? I could teach. Comanche children could learn English and math, and white children could learn about medicinal plants and traditions. Or I could be a trader, like Morin, helping both sides understand what the other needs. Or I could be a healer, Mori suggested. Each cell says you have a gift for that. I could be many things, Agioka said with a smile. That's the exciting part. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, the three stood in silence, watching the valley spread out before them. It was a landscape that spoke of possibilities, of wounds healing, of communities growing, of children who might grow up in a world slightly better than the one their parents had known. Do you know what I like most about this place? Agioka said finally. What? Dakota asked. That no matter what was before or what others thought it should be, only what it is now matters. It was a lesson she had learned not just about places, but about people, including herself. The scared child who had expected to die under a dead tree had become a young woman who planted cedars and dreamed of building bridges between worlds. That night at camp, there was a celebration, not a formal ceremony, but simply a gathering of family and friends around the fire, sharing food and stories. No Coney spoke about the visions he had lately, visions of peace and cooperation that seemed more possible each day. Each cell taught some of the younger children a new song. She had composed about trees growing in unexpected places. And Agioka, sitting between Dakota and Mori, listened and laughed and added her own stories to the mix. She was no longer the silent outsider who had arrived at camp months ago. She was Agioka, she who brought joy, daughter of Dakota, sister of his people, citizen of two worlds. Later, when the fire had dwindled to embers and most people had retired to their teepees, Dakota and Agioka walked to the edge of the camp to look at the stars. Do you regret finding me? She asked softly. Do you ever regret surviving long enough for me to find you? He countered. No, she said immediately. Not for a second. Then you have your answer. They stood there for a while longer, father and daughter, watching the night sky and listening to the quiet sounds of the camp behind them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new possibilities for both pain and joy. But tonight, they were simply a family at peace, having found in each other exactly what they hadn't known they were looking for. And somewhere in the valley, a small cedar sapling extended its roots deeper into the earth, beside a tree that had learned, after all, that dying didn't always mean the end. Sometimes, it meant making space for something new and beautiful to grow.